The morning rush had barely begun, but the city was already awake. Frost clung to the bus windows, and the low winter sun cast a pale orange glow across the streets. Inside the number 42 bus, Thomas Briggs, a stocky man in his mid-50s with a faded transit cap pulled low over his brow, sat behind the wheel, coffee cup balanced precariously on the dashboard. He had been driving this route for over 20 years, and in his mind, he knew every face that usually boarded at every stop. By 7:05 a.m., the bus was idling at the corner of Fairview and Ninth, a stop Thomas privately referred to as Trouble Corner. It was the one where he often encountered passengers who didn't have fare ready, who caused delays, or who, in his view, looked like they were up to something. He'd never admit it out loud, but sometimes he judged people before they even stepped aboard. This morning, as the doors hissed open, the usual crowd shuffled on: commuters in heavy coats, a couple of high school kids with earbuds in, a nurse in scrubs yawning into her coffee cup. Then, Thomas saw him. A tall black man in his early 40s, wearing a simple navy peacoat and carrying a worn leather satchel, stepped forward. There was nothing outwardly alarming about him, but his clothes looked more workmanlike than businesslike, and his shoes were dusty, as if he'd been walking a long way. "Morning," the man said politely, reaching into his pocket. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "You got fare?" The man paused, pulling out a transit card. "Yes, right here." Thomas glanced at it and frowned. "That card looks old. We switched to new passes last year. You'll need to pay cash or get a new one." "I was told these still work," the man replied evenly, tapping the card toward the scanner. Thomas didn't move his hand from the barrier button. "Not on my bus. Rules are rules, cash fare or no ride." The man's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. "I just came across town to get to a meeting. I'm not trying to cause trouble." Thomas shook his head, already impatient. "Then you should have planned better. Step aside so I can keep schedule." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. The man looked at Thomas for a long moment, not angry, just disappointed. Without another word, he stepped back onto the curb. The doors hissed shut, and Thomas pulled away, muttering to himself about people always trying to bend the rules. What Thomas didn't know, and wouldn't find out until much later that day, was that the man he had just refused to let board wasn't a random commuter at all. He was Daniel Harris, the newly appointed city transit director, riding the routes incognito to see how passengers were treated. And Thomas had just made himself the star of the wrong kind of story. Daniel Harris stood on the icy sidewalk, watching the number 42 pull away, its exhaust curling into the crisp morning air. He could still see the driver's rigid posture through the glass, shoulders squared in a way that said he felt entirely justified in what he'd just done. Daniel exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to shake his head. 20 years in public transit had taught him that moments like this, moments when someone in a position of small authority chose gatekeeping over understanding, said a lot about the system as a whole. This was exactly why he had started these undercover evaluations. Ever since he'd been appointed transit director 3 months ago, he'd been sifting through piles of passenger complaints. Drivers ignoring riders at stops, snapping at them, refusing them entry for minor issues, or enforcing rules selectively. On paper, the official policy about the older transit cards was clear. They were still valid until the end of the year. Yet here he was, holding one that should have let him ride, turned away without so much as a second scan. Pulling his coat tighter against the wind, Daniel took a few steps down the block toward the next bus stop. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder about his 8 a.m. meeting at the downtown transit hub. It was the one he'd planned for weeks, where he intended to unveil his findings to the board and propose new rider training protocols. He had intended to gather a few more examples before presenting, but now he had something else: a personal experience that cut straight to the heart of the issue. The truth was, Daniel didn't look like the picture-perfect commuter drivers imagined. He preferred practical clothing when out in the field: boots instead of polished dress shoes, a coat that could handle rain or snow instead of a suit jacket. And he knew from years of observation that appearances shaped treatment more than anyone wanted to admit. As he waited at the next stop, he caught his reflection in the shelter's scratched plexiglass. A working man, nothing more. And that was the point. If he, with all his authority, could be denied service so easily, what happened to the people without power, without the ability to file a formal complaint that got noticed? The next bus screeched to a halt in front of him. This driver, a young woman with a warm smile, waved him aboard before he could even pull out his card. Cold morning, huh? Go ahead and get settled. The contrast was like night and day. Daniel thanked her, tapped his card, which beeped green instantly, and took a seat near the middle. As the bus rumbled toward downtown, he made a note in his small leather-bound notebook. 42 line, 7:05 a.m., Fairview and 9th. Driver refused entry despite valid pass. Tone dismissive, no attempt to verify policy. Follow-up required. He underlined the words twice. This wasn't just going into his report. After today, it would become part of a conversation that driver would not soon forget. Thomas Briggs was halfway through his morning shift when he first caught wind that something unusual was brewing. He had just pulled into the depot for his 15-minute break, the familiar hiss of the air brakes filling the bay, when another driver, Pete Lawson, strolled over with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Pete leaned against the side of Thomas's bus, smirking the way he did when he thought he knew something worth sharing. "Hey, Briggs," Pete said casually. "Hear about the guy doing surprise ride-alongs?" Thomas frowned, taking a slow sip from his own coffee. "What guy?" Pete shrugged. "Some higher-up from downtown? New transit director or something? Word is he's been riding buses incognito, checking how drivers treat passengers. Doesn't announce himself. Just blends in, makes notes, that sort of thing." Thomas snorted, rolling his eyes. "Sure, and next you'll tell me the mayor's handing out tickets at the subway turnstiles." But Pete's grin didn't fade. "Laugh if you want, but I heard it from dispatch. Apparently he's been on our routes, even the 42nd. Could have been anyone you turned away lately." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. He tried to shake it off, but his mind immediately jumped to the tall man from that morning. The one with the old transit card and calm, steady voice. Something about the way that man had looked at him, not angry, but disappointed, now played over in his head like a replay he couldn't shut off. He muttered, "Guy didn't even have the right pass." Pete raised an eyebrow. "Those old cards are still valid until December. Didn't you get the memo?" Thomas's stomach tightened. "They are?" "Yeah," Pete said, taking a sip of coffee. "Rulebook says so. If someone told you different, they were wrong. If you turned somebody away because of that..." He let the implication hang there, heavy in the chilly depot air. Thomas didn't reply, but a dull weight began to settle in his chest. He had always prided himself on keeping order on his bus, but now he wondered if that had just turned into a habit of deciding who deserved a ride and who didn't, without thinking twice. The depot intercom crackled, calling drivers back to their vehicles. Thomas climbed into his seat, but his hands lingered on the steering wheel before he started the engine. He told himself it was nothing, just a rumor, but the thought gnawed at him as he pulled out of the bay. Somewhere in the city, that man was probably already at his meeting. If he really was this so-called transit director, Thomas knew his name, and maybe even his face, could be on someone's desk by the end of the day. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt the smallest sliver of fear about what might come next. Daniel Harris arrived at the downtown transit headquarters just before 8 o'clock, the winter wind following him into the marble-floored lobby. The building, with its polished brass fixtures and faint smell of fresh coffee, was a far cry from the bus stop where he'd started his morning. As he passed through security, he greeted the receptionist with a nod and made his way to the glass-walled conference room on the second floor. Inside, the long oak table was already lined with department heads, dispatch supervisors, and a few city council liaisons. Clipboards, tablets, and styrofoam cups of coffee littered the surface. Daniel slid into the seat at the head of the table, setting his leather satchel beside him. A few faces turned his way with polite smiles, though most were still busy with side conversations. When the meeting officially began, Daniel wasted no time. "Today," he said, his voice steady, but carrying enough weight to draw every eye in the room, "I want to talk about something that can't be measured by route efficiency reports or maintenance logs. I want to talk about the human experience of riding our buses and the choices our drivers make when they're the first point of contact for the public." He reached into his bag, pulling out his small notebook. This morning at 7:05 a.m., I attempted to board the number 42 at Fairview and Ninth. I presented a valid transit card, still within its acceptable use period according to official policy. He paused just long enough for a few people to glance at each other. The driver refused to let me on, citing an incorrect assumption that my card was expired. He made no attempt to verify the policy, and when I explained I was simply trying to get to my destination, he dismissed me and told me to plan better. There was a subtle shift in the room. A few tightened jaws, a dispatch manager lowering his gaze to the table. Daniel continued. Now, I wasn't wearing a suit. I didn't look like someone with authority. I looked like an ordinary commuter, because that's the point of these ride-alongs. If I, as the person responsible for this entire system, can be treated this way, what do you think happens to our most vulnerable riders? A woman from the customer service department raised her hand tentatively. Sir, do you know who the driver was? Daniel met her eyes. Yes. I took note of his name and bus number. But this isn't about punishing one person in isolation. It's about understanding the culture that makes this kind of snap judgment acceptable. He closed the notebook and folded his hands on the table. We will be reviewing driver training immediately, with a focus on empathy, policy accuracy, and professional conduct. I also expect full cooperation when we address specific incidents with those involved. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the building's heating system. Finally, one of the senior supervisors cleared his throat. We'll need to bring in the driver for a debrief. If the incident happened today, we can have him here this afternoon. Daniel nodded once. Do it. I want to speak to him personally. As the meeting moved on to other business, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had no interest in humiliating anyone, but he did want the driver to understand the impact of that moment on the curb. Not just on him, but on every rider who had ever been turned away for no good reason. And when that conversation happened, there would be no mistaking who was in the driver's seat this time. Thomas Briggs was just pulling his bus into the turnaround loop for his lunch break when the radio on the dashboard crackled to life. Driver 42B, report to headquarters after your current run. Repeat, report to headquarters immediately after your current run. You are relieved from afternoon service. Dispatch out. The message was short, but it hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Drivers didn't get called downtown in the middle of a shift unless something serious had happened. An accident, a complaint, or a disciplinary matter. His mind flashed back to Pete's words that morning and to the tall man with the old transit card. He tried to tell himself it could be anything. Maybe they needed him for a special route, maybe a routine review. But deep down, he knew better. The timing was too perfect. As he finished the loop, he barely noticed the streets blurring past the windshield. The chatter of passengers faded into background noise, his focus narrowing on the unease gnawing at his stomach. At the final stop, he opened the doors and watched the last rider step down into the cold air. When the bus was empty, he sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles pale. The drive to headquarters felt shorter than it ever had, though every red light seemed to mock him. By the time he parked in the staff lot and stepped onto the salted pavement, he could feel a light sheen of sweat beneath his uniform jacket despite the chill. Inside, the receptionist barely looked up before pointing him toward the second-floor conference room. Walking down that hallway felt like marching to judgment. His boots sounded too loud on the polished floor, and each step seemed to echo off the walls. He reached the door, paused, and took a breath. When he pushed it open, the first thing he saw was the man from that morning, seated at the head of the long table, a leather notebook in front of him, calm but unreadable. Around him sat several department heads and a senior supervisor. Thomas froze in the doorway, his worst fear confirmed in an instant. The man wasn't just some commuter. He was someone with authority, someone who had clearly been waiting for him. Mr. Briggs, the supervisor said, gesturing to an empty chair. Have a seat. We have something to discuss. Thomas stepped inside, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. As he sat down, the tall man closed his notebook slowly and folded his hands on the table. I think, the man said, his voice measured but firm, you and I met earlier this morning. Thomas didn't reply. He didn't need to. The knot in his stomach had already told him exactly how bad this was going to be. Thomas sat stiffly in the chair, his cap resting in his lap, fingers curling and uncurling around the brim. Across the table, the tall man he had turned away that morning studied him with the same calm, level gaze he'd worn at the bus stop. The silence stretched until it felt like a weight pressing on Thomas's shoulders. Finally, the man spoke. "My name is Daniel Harris. I'm the city's transit director." His tone was steady without mockery or anger, but the words still landed like a cold slap. "For the last few months, I've been riding different routes unannounced to see what riders experience firsthand. I don't give advance notice. I don't wear a suit. I want to know exactly how people are treated when no one thinks they're being watched." Thomas shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. "Look, about this morning, you refused me entry," Daniel continued, his voice firm but not raised. "Despite the fact that my transit card was valid until December, you didn't scan it. You didn't check with dispatch. You made a decision based on an assumption and sent me away." A flush crept up Thomas's neck. "I thought the old cards were done. Nobody told me otherwise." "That's not true," one of the supervisors interjected. "The memo went out to all drivers in October, and it was covered in the last training session." Thomas's mouth went dry. He remembered the training now, vaguely among dozens of other policy updates. But he also remembered how he'd barely listened to that section, convinced he already knew how to handle expired cards. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Mr. Briggs, but I need you to understand the bigger picture. You turned away someone who had the right to be on that bus. In my case, I had other options. I caught another ride. But what if I hadn't? What if I was an elderly passenger, or someone headed to a critical appointment, or a parent trying to get their kid to school? Your decision could have real consequences for someone's life." The words settled heavily in the room. Thomas looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes for the first time. There was no smugness there, no satisfaction at catching him out, only the steady conviction of someone who believed in what he was saying. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, Thomas said quietly. "I thought I was keeping order, making sure people followed the rules." Daniel nodded. "Order matters. Rules matter. But so does respect. And when we're wrong, we have to be willing to admit it and learn from it." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "I'd like to see you back on your route, but I also want you in the next training session. We're focusing on empathy and proper policy checks. You have experience worth sharing, Mr. Briggs, but you need to pair it with the right mindset." For the first time that day, Thomas felt the tightness in his chest ease, just slightly. He wasn't being fired, at least not yet. This was a warning, but also an opening. He nodded once. "I understand." Daniel leaned back, his expression softening. "Good. Because the people who ride our buses deserve better. And I believe you can do better." Thomas didn't know if it was relief or shame that made him look down again, but he knew one thing. The next time someone stepped onto his bus, he'd think twice before deciding they didn't belong. 2 weeks later, Thomas Briggs was back on his regular morning route. The winter air sharp and dry, the city still shaking off the early dawn. He had spent the days since that meeting with Daniel replaying their conversation in his mind, the words about respect and empathy echoing every time he stopped to pick someone up. He'd gone to the new training session without complaint, something he might have scoffed at before, and had sat through every minute, not just hearing the policies, but understanding why they existed. Now, behind the wheel, he felt the weight of his job differently. At 7:03 a.m., he pulled up to the Fairview and Ninth stop, the same one where the incident had happened. The doors opened with their familiar hiss, and passengers shuffled aboard. Then, halfway through the crowd, he saw him. Daniel Harris, dressed the same way as before in a simple coat and worn satchel, blending in with the commuters. For a split second, Thomas's pulse jumped. He didn't know if this was a test or just coincidence, but either way, he wasn't going to blow it. "Good morning, sir," he said warmly, leaning slightly to make eye contact. "Go ahead and tap your card when you're ready." Daniel stepped up, swiped his old-style transit card, still valid until the end of the month. And this time, Thomas watched the scanner's green light flash without interruption. "Looks like it's working fine," Thomas said with a small smile. Welcome aboard." Daniel gave a polite nod, nothing more, and moved to take a seat near the front. But Thomas noticed the faintest hint of approval in his eyes, as if he'd marked the change in tone. The rest of the ride passed uneventfully. Passengers found seats, the bus rolled through familiar streets, and the morning sunlight slowly brightened the sidewalks. As they approached the downtown transit hub, Daniel rose from his seat and walked to the front. He waited until the bus stopped before speaking, his voice pitched low so only Thomas could hear. "Much better," he said simply, a faint smile touching his lips. "Keep it up." Then, he stepped off into the bustle of the city, disappearing into the crowd without another glance. Thomas sat there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the doors stay open as he watched Daniel vanish. There was no big speech, no handshake, no formal acknowledgement. But it was enough. He knew he had passed this time. When the doors closed and the bus pulled back into traffic, Thomas felt a quiet sense of pride settle over him. Not the kind that came from being right or enforcing the rules, but from knowing he'd done the job the way it was meant to be done. And as he steered the bus toward the next stop, he decided that from now on, every passenger would get the same respect, whether they were carrying a brand new card, an old one, or just the hope of making it to where they needed to go.